Hopefully it stays with me for the next 2 hours or however long this class is supposed to go. We'll see. This always happens on like week 2 of the quarter. It's like I'm just talking too much and my voice gets tired. Okay, so today we're going to start talking about these different periods of development. We're starting off obviously with infancy. We're going to cover infancy and toddlerhood together. So basically talking about the first 2 years of life here. And every period will kind of be broken up into these 2 different sections. We'll talk about physical and cognitive development first, and then next time we'll talk about social and emotional development, and we'll kind of do it that way for every period as we go throughout the quarter. So today's infancy and toddlerhood, we're talking specifically about physical and cognitive development. And something you all might know if you've ever spent any amount of time around a baby is that this time is marked by very extreme growth. So it's during the first few years is when you'll have the most dramatic growth of any time period in your life. We'll talk about kind of how your body basically I think quadruples or something like that in the first 2 years. So putting on lots of physical weight and then also making all kinds of cognitive developments as well. So during this time, the brain is growing just as much as the rest of the body, and that allows for all kinds of advances in cognition. So real quickly, I'm just kind of curious, how many of you in the past 3 or 4 years have spent any time around a baby or a toddler, maybe a niece or a nephew or something like that? Okay. That just gives me a little bit of an idea of kind of what your perspective might be, how much experience you have in this domain. I will say I have a son who's 15, so it's been 15 years since I was around a baby, really. I guess I do have 2 nieces, but they have mostly lived really far away. Until just recently, they actually moved pretty close to us, but so I haven't had a ton of time around infants recently. So all this is kind of in my distant memory a little bit. But, so first let's talk a little bit about physical growth. So when a baby is born, typically the longest they're going to be is around 20 inches long. That's pretty long for a newborn baby, but somewhere kind of in that range. Typically around 7.5 to 8 pounds. It's kind of the average when they're born. And then, like I said, by the end of year 2, you can see that has basically quadrupled. So they have, gone to 4 times their original size in the course of 2 years. So I want you to just think about if from now until 2 years from now, you quadrupled in size. So whatever your weight is, take that times 4 and imagine being that in 2 years. That's a massive amount of growth to happen in that short of amount of time. So it's a very, very extreme growth that's happening here. And the growth doesn't happen equally in all parts of the body. It kind of follows these trends where certain parts grow first and then other parts grow later. So the cephalocaudal trend refers to the fact that typically the head is going to grow first and then the rest of the body will follow in growth. So if you ever see an infant or even getting into the toddler years, they typically have a proportionately very large head, which can be difficult for them to support. In addition to that, there's this trend called the proximodistal trend, where basically kind of the inner core of the body grows first, and then the limbs and things grow later. So again, if you look at a toddler or someone that's about a year old, they typically will have a very kind of girthy trunk basically, lots of growth to their middle section, but their limbs and their fingers and things might still be proportionately really short. So all their proportions are kind of off during these first 4 years, but you have lots of that growth, particularly in kind of the core of the body. The 2 main things that will drive this growth in terms of how much you can expect a child to grow during this time are going to be heredity and nutrition. So I think we kind of talked about this a little bit last time, this idea that height and overall body size is very largely determined by genes. It's about 80% of a person's height can be attributed to their genes, to the heredity from their parents. So then the next important thing is nutrition. So even if a child has the genes to grow very tall and very large, if they're not given adequate nutrition in the first couple of years of life, then it's very likely that they will not reach that full potential. For an infant, the best nutrition that they can receive is typically going to be through breastfeeding. It's often recommended that the mother, if she is able to, breastfeeds for at least the first year. And there are all kinds of benefits to breastfeeding. One of them is that breast milk is going to have the most like full nutrition. So if you compare like breast milk to formula, breast milk is going to always have like the correct proportions of fats and proteins, and it's going to have all the nutrients that the baby needs, whereas formula might not necessarily have 100% of those nutrients. Formulas now are getting much better, so comparatively, nutrition-wise, they might be on par kind of at this point, but especially historically, breast milk would have been the best way to get proper nutrition. In addition to that nutrition, though, breastfeeding has all kinds of other benefits as well. So one benefit that breastfeeding has is that it can actually confer immunity to the baby. So if the mom has developed antibodies to like the flu, or even I think there's evidence that COVID antibodies can also pass through breast milk. So then the infant is going to start building up their immune system right away because they're getting those antibodies from their mother's breast milk. There's also evidence that just shows that, babies that breastfeed tend to be, have sort of a closer attachment and connection to their caregivers, to their mother. So there's, again, all kinds of benefits to using breast milk. I was just looking at my notes because I feel like I'm overlooking some. Oh, it's also been shown that they have better tooth and jaw development as well. So if they're, having breast milk instead of a bottle, sometimes bottles can interfere with the development of like the teeth and the jawbone. So breast milk is better for that. So if a child is malnourished, then that can, like I said, kind of stunt their growth. There's about 2 million children annually that are affected by malnutrition during this time, during these first 2 years of life. About a third of children will basically have some kind of growth stunt due to malnutrition before they're 5 years old. So in the first 5 years of life, it's quite a large proportion of people that are affected by it. In the US specifically, it affects about 19% of children. So it can be a pretty big problem all over the world. In addition to malnutrition, kind of the other side of that, it's also important during this time that infants aren't overfed. There's evidence that if there's overfeeding happening in the first 2 years of life, then that can predict obesity later on, which can obviously cause all kinds of issues in childhood and into adulthood. So it's good during this time, like I said, breast milk, and then avoiding things that are high in like sugar, fat, and salt as the child develops the ability to eat solid foods, especially avoiding some of those more like, not healthy foods can help maintain healthy growth throughout their childhood. In addition to kind of growth of overall body, like I said, there's tremendous brain growth happening as well. And the brain is growing both in size, but also in the number of neurons and synapses in the brain. So essentially, I think it's around 2 years old that the number of neurons and synapses actually peaks. So you'll continue to make new neurons up until 2. And then eventually what will happen is those neurons will actually start to be pruned. They will go through this process that's called apoptosis. I'll spell that real quick. I went down a weird rabbit hole last week trying to figure out the correct pronunciation of this word. Many of you ever heard this word before, like a biology class or anything? I don't know where this came from, but I've always pronounced it apoptosis, and I was listening to some medical podcast, and they pronounced it apoptosis, like the P silent. And so I did a bunch of research, tried to figure out the correct pronunciation, and apparently it's a whole controversy and debate that I was not aware of until a week ago. I'm going to say apoptosis because that's how I've always said it, and there's no consensus. But you might hear the word apoptosis somewhere else if you ever are reading about this stuff. But apoptosis is basically this process where a cell is essentially programmed to die off if it's not getting adequate stimulation. So there are lots of cells in the body that are like this, but neurons in particular are kind of pre-programmed to undergo this apoptosis. So if a neuron is not being fired sufficiently during these first 2 years, then basically your body decides, okay, this neuron is taking up too many resources, but it's not actually being used for anything, so we're just going to let it die off. And so you peak at the number of neurons that you're going to have around 2, and then you actually start to lose neurons from there, which sounds bad, but it's actually a good thing. It actually helps your body kind of devote resources to the neurons that you need so that those can function more effectively, and then you're kind of getting rid of the waste through this synaptic pruning process. We'll talk a little bit more about synaptic pruning. I can't remember if it's later in this lecture or the one Thursday, whenever we talk about language development, because it's really relevant to that. So we'll kind of come back to that concept. So your brain is growing during these first 2 years. Number of neurons and synapses is increasing up to 2. In addition to that, there's also myelin being placed on the neurons as well. So a lot of neurons are wrapped in this substance called myelin, which is kind of like a fatty substance that wraps around the neurons to help insulate it and make them faster. And myelination happens really throughout your whole lifetime. There's certain parts of your brain that won't be fully myelinated until you're in like your early to late 20s. But there's a lot of myelination going on during those first 2 years, kind of in all parts of the brain. In addition to growing, the brain is also learning and it's becoming kind of specialized. So your brain is not just like this one thing. It's just a single organ that's like you doing everything all the time. It's divided up into all these different sections, different systems, different components, and all those components have different functions. So there's some parts of your brain that are really important for like processing vision. There's other parts of your brain that are important for language. It's kind of split up into all these different parts, right? And it's also split up into 2 halves. So you have a left half and a right half. And in general, those 2 halves are going to have different functions as well. So language, for example, tends to be mostly processed in the left hemisphere of the brain and not the right. So when a baby is first born, its brain is not specialized like that. It's kind of just firing, I wouldn't say randomly, but it's firing a lot to a lot of different things. So the areas of the brain are all kind of trying to do everything. And as the baby learns during these first 2 years, the brain starts to kind of like divide up labor more efficiently and lateralize to where the right brain is going to start handling some things and the left brain is going to start handling other things. A really important concept, again, kind of throughout a lot of childhood, but particularly in these first 2 years, is what's called sensitive periods. There's another word called critical period, which means kind of the same thing. So a critical period or a sensitive period is basically a window of time during which the child has to be exposed to certain stimuli, and if they're not exposed to those stimuli at that time, then they won't develop properly. So for example, children have to be exposed to some kind of language during the first, I'm going to say 8-ish years of their life. And if they're not, if something prevents them from being exposed to language during those first 8 years, then even if they start trying to learn a language at like age 9 or 10, it's going to be basically impossible for them to do so because they've passed this critical period or sensitive period where their brains were kind of built to absorb language during that time. So there are sensitive periods for just about everything you can imagine. So like for visual input, if like you have to be exposed to lots of very diverse visual stimuli in order for your visual system to develop properly. Any of you know what astigmatism is? May have astigmatism. It's basically where like things are kind of blurry at certain orientations. If you have astigmatism and you can describe it better than me, then feel free because I don't have it. But basically, like, you know, someone with astigmatism, things that are vertical, they might be able to see clearly, but things that are horizontal are going to be like a little bit blurry. And then maybe, you know, like things in between will kind of be a little bit blurry or whatever. So there's kind of like they don't see clearly at certain orientations, basically. And one theory about what causes astigmatism, or at least one contributing factor, is that they may not have been exposed to enough visual stimuli during a critical period of development. So if, like, you know, all of the angles in your crib and the toys that you have around you when you're a baby, if you have lots of horizontal angles but no verticals for some reason, then you might not develop the ability to perceive those vertical angles as well as the horizontal ones. Okay, same thing with like colors, contrast, depth. If you think about all the different things that your visual system is doing, you have to be exposed to stimuli that kind of capture all of those categories during the sensitive period, or you might not develop properly. And then again, kind of same thing with like hearing or touch or smell or taste or any of your senses, any of your sort of cognitive abilities like language, they're all going to have a sensitive period that's kind of tied to them. So there are lots of those sensitive periods in this first 2 years of life. So I guess kind of main thing to take away from that is that if you're ever around an infant that's developing, if you have kids of your own in the future, you have nieces and nephews, you want to make sure that they're exposed to a lot of diversity and stimuli during those first 2 years. You want lots of stimulation, lots of engagement, colors, contrast, all of that, so that they can develop properly. I have a video here, and I think I put it in there like after I'd already developed this PowerPoint. I'm trying to remember if I put it in there by accident or not, which I know is silly. I should have looked at this before, but so I'm trying to decide if I should play it or not. Let me fast forward a bit just so I can see if I can remember what it's about.
A piece of the brain assembled, you just want to out to each other. Development. How is it that each one of those?
Yeah, I remember now. Sorry about that. I also don't have volume turned up very well. Here we go. Okay, so this video is kind of just showing that process of synaptic pruning a little bit. So it's talking about how we sort of like develop neurons, and then how, how it's decided which neurons get pruned away, essentially. So I'll go ahead and play it.
A piece of the brain, the size of a grain of rice, contains about 10,000 nerve cells, just in that little piece. You can just imagine how many pieces you have in your head. Within that 10,000 nerve cells, each nerve cell can make anywhere between 1 to 10,000 connections with other nerve cells. So there are something like 1 trillion connections.
It's almost overwhelming to think about the whole thing. If you think about how the whole brain and nervous system gets assembled, you just want to throw up your hands and say it's way too complicated. We're never going to understand it. The brain is the seat of our consciousness, of who we are. And in understanding where it comes from, we understand where we come from.
By 24 weeks, the vital organs of the fetus are well formed. The primitive heart can beat on its own. The once powerless lungs are now prepared to fill with air. And the brain has nearly its full complement of billions and billions of neurons, reaching out to each other, building connections with mind-boggling speed, nearly 2 million every second, until the brain has become a tightly packed network of trillions of crisscrossing wires, with more connections than stars in the sky. You can imagine the size of the wiring problem. So how is that problem solved? How is that achieved during development? How is it that each one of those trillion connections is made appropriately?
You might think, oh, what a mess. It's just going to be a jumble of connections and wires all over the place. But in fact, the nervous system seems to have a strategy.
The strategy is in the genes. The brain begins to wire itself by following a precisely specified genetic blueprint. The connections are following very defined rules. Go out of the eye, turn right at the optic chiasm, cross the chiasm, head toward the lateral geniculate nucleus, grow into the lateral geniculate nucleus. Don't grow into the medial geniculate nucleus because that's an auditory structure. So you can imagine the first stage of brain wiring is kind of like solving the problem of connecting phones in New York to phones in Boston. Making sure that you're making connections between Boston and New York and not Boston and Washington, D.C. And that's all specified genetically. Now then there's a second phase of brain wiring. Let's say you want to place a phone call to your grandmother in New York. And you want that phone to ring, on Park Avenue and 47th or whatever. And you don't want the phone to ring up at the Waldorf Astoria. Okay, how do you get that precise phone to ring? That's the second phase of brain wiring. If you place a phone call to your grandmother early in development, her phone will ring. But so will a lot of other phones. So there are a lot of connections that are made. If the connections are correct and being used, they get strengthened. If they're not being used, or they're only being used occasionally, they're lost. We could call it use it or lose it.
Okay, so like I said, that kind of described that synaptic pruning concept a little bit more. So main things to take away from that, you don't have to worry a ton about, like, she was listing off detailed structures and things like that. Don't worry about that. Main thing I want you to take away from that video is that first stage of, like, building the brain is mostly driven by genetics, and that's just connecting large structures from one to the other. And then this really precise connection that we want to make happens through synaptic pruning, through that concept, like she called it, use it or lose it. Basically, the synapses that are being used, the neurons that are being used will be strengthened. The ones that are not being used will die off. Another thing I kind of just want to point out, because this video reminded me of it, is she was saying that at the beginning, whenever you're first born, your nervous system is first developing, she said, she was using the phone call metaphor. If you place a phone call from Boston to New York, all the phones in New York are going to ring instead of the precise one you want. So I want to just kind of step back and have you imagine what it might actually be like to be an infant perceptually. Because basically what's happening is their brains aren't quite specialized yet. Their neurons haven't learned to fire at precise times. And so they're just kind of being overwhelmed with firing in their brain all the time. And so when an infant looks out at the world, a newborn infant, they don't see like we see, they don't hear like we hear, they don't feel like we feel. Everything's kind of blurry and mushy is kind of how I would describe it maybe. So visually, things are going to be blurry. Their acuity is not very good. They can't see precise details. And there's some evidence that they might not even be able to do what's called binding. So binding is where basically you know that, like, my thermos is one structure. It's shiny and metal and it's a teal color and you could feel it and it feels hard, right? Like there's all these things about my thermos that are true about it. But as an infant, they might not bind all that together. They might just see kind of like there's some teal and there's some shiny and there's some black, but they don't see it as like one object that's coherent and bound together. So for an infant, everything's just kind of like blurry and muddy and messy. Same thing with their hearing, right? Like sounds they hear, they're not going to know what those sounds are. Those sounds are going to have no meaning to them. They're going to perceive it very differently than we do. Then over time, they develop those abilities, they develop those skills, their vision and everything becomes more precise and more accurate. So we'll kind of talk about specific perceptual things that are happening in just a minute. The other thing to note, so the brain at this time is very plastic, it's very malleable, so kind of relating back to those sensitive and critical periods, it can learn and absorb new information very well at this time. It's like a sponge just absorbing everything. So the infant's brain is very plastic and very malleable. Because of that, if part of the brain is damaged early on, especially if it's like a small part for some reason, other parts of the brain might be able to adapt and kind of take over whatever structure was damaged. So if they have damage to like their visual cortex, then the auditory structures might kind of grow into there to help compensate. And again, it's very plastic and malleable at this time. Okay, in addition to like the physical growth that's happening, the brain growth, there are also some changes happening in their sleep-wake cycle. So when an infant is first born, they're going to sleep almost all the time. They will sleep at least over 18 hours a day, right? So there's 24 hours in a day. That's only 6 hours that they're awake. And that's going to be, it's not like they'll be awake for 6 hours straight and then sleep for 18 hours. That's interspersed more, where like they'll maybe be awake for 30 minutes and then sleep for a couple hours, and then be awake for 30 minutes and sleep for a couple hours. Over the first 2 years, they will gradually shift to more of like a normal night-day schedule, where they will start sleeping during the nighttime and staying awake for most of the day. Although most children, even at 2 years old, they're going to need naps. They're going to sleep a lot more than the 8 hours a day that's recommended for adults. By 2, they're probably sleeping, maybe like 12 hours a day, something like that. So they might get, like 10 hours of sleep overnight and then take like a 2-hour nap in the middle of the day, something like that. That shift to the night-day schedule, there's all kinds of physical and biological things going on, but also cultural things as well that are going to drive that change. First, there are developments in the brain, like we already talked about, and some of those brain developments help shift to that night-day cycle. In addition, there's also increased melatonin secretion. So melatonin is this substance that basically builds up in your body throughout the day. It actually, whenever, it has to do with like light, basically. Whenever it starts to get dark, the melatonin starts to build up, and then as it gets to a certain level, you basically get really sleepy, you want to go to sleep. Infants, they don't really have, like, their melatonin production isn't tied to that day-night cycle whenever they're first born, and they also don't have as much melatonin that they're secreting. So over those 2 years, part of the gradual change that happens is that they start to shift to that, like, normal melatonin schedule that you will have into adulthood. But then, like I said, it's also influenced heavily by culture. So some cultures sleep, have different sleep patterns than we do. They might take, naps during the day more often than we do in the US. They might have what's called a biphasic sleep. There's some cultures where, they'll go to sleep at maybe like 8 o'clock at night and sleep for like 4 hours. And then they'll wake up in the middle of the night and do things like clean or whatever, and then go back to sleep again for another 4 hours. So there's some cultures that have that more like biphasic sleep, and infants that are born into that culture will shift to that kind of similar schedule. Parental needs will also drive this, obviously. So as the parent maybe needs to return to work or just back to kind of a normal schedule, the parents will often try to start training their child to sleep through the night. There's lots of different approaches to doing that. And then also just the attachment style that the parent and the child have can also drive this kind of shift. So children that are highly attached to their parent, where they're like, they don't want to leave their parent's side, they may co-sleep or sleep in the same room or be more likely to do so than children that maybe have a little less of attachment, that are a little bit more independent. Speaking of co-sleeping, so co-sleeping is where the infant and the parent sleep in the same physical bed. And it's not typical in the US for co-sleeping to happen. But it is the norm in like 90% of other countries. So in most other countries, co-sleeping during these first 2 years is extremely common. And there's actually some evidence that co-sleeping can be very beneficial. So first of all, sometimes it can help the infant sleep a little bit better. So they might get more quality and quantity of sleep, which can help their brain development and their growth and all of that. It can also be really convenient for the parents, especially if the mother is breastfeeding. If the baby's sleeping right there in bed and they start crying because they want food, it's very easy to just kind of like sit up or roll over and breastfeed for a little bit and then go back to sleep, rather than having to physically get up, go to a different room, get the baby from the crib, go sit in, a recliner or whatever and breastfeed for a while and then go back to sleep. Co-sleeping makes it a little bit easier to do that. There's also some evidence that if co-sleeping is done correctly, it can actually protect the child from what's called sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. So sudden infant death syndrome is what it sounds. It's where basically a baby dies while it's sleeping, and there's not a lot of great evidence about why it happens. Sometimes it has to do with just the position that the baby's sleeping in. They might have difficulty breathing or something like that. But there's evidence that whenever parents and the infant co-sleep, that SIDS is much less likely to happen. It might be because the parents can kind of sense, that if the infant stops breathing or something, especially mothers are often very attuned to like very small sounds and things. So they might actually notice and then wake up and shift the baby around. But if it's done correctly, then co-sleeping can actually protect the child from SIDS. So it's kind of interesting that it seems to be like taboo in the US. I'm not entirely sure where that came from or why it started, or I don't know, maybe like the crib industry. It's like, hey, co-sleeping is bad, you should buy a crib for your infant. I have no idea. It's all speculation, but for whatever reason.
My grandmother was very adamant while I was in Arizona with her that the baby needed to sleep in the crib, and I'm like, but the baby sleeps in the bed, otherwise she doesn't sleep. Yeah. Like I said, and it might be a generational thing too, like maybe later generations will be more open to co-sleeping, but it seems like definitely, at least in the past, 100 years or so in the US, people have been very against co-sleeping. And again, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from or what culturally happened to make people decide that it was bad, but yeah. So, all right, so we've got all these physical growth, brain growth, sleep-wake cycles changing. In addition, there are some pretty major motor developments that are happening as well. Again, if you just think about the difference between a newborn baby and a 2-year-old, right? A newborn baby can't even lift their head.
You know, at the most they can maybe roll over, and that's about it. They often cannot even grab things. If they might just kind of flail their arms around wildly. Whereas a 2-year-old is going to be able to walk, they're going to be able to pick things up and hold them. They might even be able to start like feeding themselves. So there's a lot of major developments in motor skills here. Gross motor skills refer to really like large scale movements, like walking, swinging your arms. Fine motor skills is more like using your fingers mostly to do very intricate movements. Things like drawing and writing would be fine motor skills. And you have development in both of these areas over the first 2 years. So by the end of the 2 years, a toddler is going to have quite a bit of control over their gross motor skills. They're going to be pretty decent at walking. They might be able to jump and run and do a few other things. Their fine motor skills are still pretty sketchy at this point. You know, if you ask a 2-year-old to draw or write, or, I mean, they wouldn't know how to write because they haven't quite learned, like, even language and spelling at this point yet, probably. But even asking them to, like, draw a circle or a shape or something, they're probably not going to be able to do very well. They can mostly just scribble at the end of the 2 years. Scaffolding is very important. So scaffolding is basically where you are building skills on top of previous skills. And because of scaffolding, infants and children develop these skills in kind of a predictable way. So a newborn infant, like I said, is basically just going to lay there, not be able to do much. One of the first skills they're going to learn is just to be able to support their head. So again, the head is going to be very heavy compared to the rest of the body. And so there's a lot of just like building neck muscle that's really important. So infants, you know, you might lay them on the ground on their stomach and have them like try to just lift their head up. That's a very good just little exercise to help them work on those neck muscles. But eventually they'll get to the point where they can sit up and they can support their own head. That's kind of step number one. Then they also might develop the skill to be able to roll over. So if you put them on their back, then they can roll over onto their stomach. Eventually they'll then develop the muscles to be able to do kind of like a push-up, like get up on their hands and knees. And then they'll develop the crawling ability. Eventually they'll get to a point where they can stand with like support. So they might have to hold on to something for balance, but they have the leg muscles they can stand. And then they'll start taking steps using that support. And then eventually they'll be able to walk without any support. So pretty much across cultures, you know, they're going to develop those skills pretty much in that order that I just laid out, because they're scaffolding, they're building skills on top of other skills. There are some cultural differences in the timing of that. So the order is going to be pretty much the same across most cultures, but some cultures, or even just like different practices individually, can change the timing of it, where some infants might learn to walk earlier, some might learn to walk later. So just as an example, I can't remember if this is from your guys' textbook or a different textbook I used in the past, but there are, I think it's in China, there's this practice where mothers were often out in like fields, like harvesting things, and they would put their babies in like a bag on their back, kind of like a baby Bjorn sort of thing, but on their back. And the baby would spend most of the day in kind of like that little backpack. And it was found that babies who were raised that way often were a little bit delayed in learning to walk. So they learned to walk a little later than babies that were not raised that way. Kind of at the opposite end, there's a culture in, I think, Jamaica, where there's this very like ingrained practice to try to exercise infants' leg muscles from a really early age. So the parents do a lot of little exercises where they'll be sitting down, they'll put the baby up to where the baby's like standing on their legs, and they'll like bounce their legs up and down. So the baby's kind of like bouncing and trying to balance, and they're obviously holding the baby's hands while they're doing this so they don't fall or whatever. But they do a lot of these like exercises intentionally to try to develop those leg muscles, and they actually start walking earlier than other cultures because of that. So there are definitely things that, you know, like a parent can do to try to develop those muscles sooner, to try to get those gross motor skills like walking kind of going a little bit faster. But again, once it starts, it's usually going to happen pretty much in the same order. Let's see. Oh, this was kind of an interesting statistic. So I read that toddlers practice walking for about 6 hours a day, and that they usually fall around 17 times per hour. So whatever 17 times 6 is, they're falling that many times in a day usually. They're actually, like, their bones and everything are more sort of malleable, so toddlers are a lot less likely to get injured if they fall compared to someone like our age or older. So they're kind of made to practice fall, kind of trial and error as they learn to walk and do all these other things. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some of the developments in perception. So like I said, starting out, the infant's world is just kind of this blurry, noisy mess that maybe doesn't make a ton of sense. But they very quickly start to develop their perceptual ability. So first we'll talk a little bit about hearing. And again, kind of with everything that we talk about in this class, these are all just general numbers. Even when I was talking about like developing gross motor skills and stuff, like the age that something happens is just kind of a guideline, but there's a huge range for developmental ages for pretty much everything. But around 4 to 7 months, they will start to have a sense of musical phrasing. So, you might be wondering, like, how do they know this for an infant? Because they can't just ask them, like, hey, do you like this song? And the infant answer, obviously that would not work. So essentially what they have done is they would test, they gave these infants all these different like musical compositions to listen to. Some of them, they would put pauses in like natural breaks in the song. So like, at the end of a verse, they would maybe put a pause there, and then at the end of a chorus, they would put a pause there. Like natural places in the song, they would put these pauses. In another version of the song, they would put pauses just kind of randomly throughout the songs. So it made it so there's these like awkward breaks where you wouldn't expect one to be. And they basically had the infants listen to the music and essentially assess like their facial expression and other things to try to figure out like which one they enjoyed the most. And they found the one that had the natural pauses, the infants tended to like listening to those more than the ones with the awkward breaks in them. So that suggested that somehow by 4 to 7 months, they have some understanding of like what musical phrasing should be like. And kind of using that similar method, they found out a bunch of other things about when they develop these other abilities. So by 6 to 7 months, they can distinguish musical tunes based on variations in rhythmic patterns. So, you can change up the rhythm a little bit of a song and they will still recognize it or know that it's different from another. I'm trying to decide if I should talk about this screens out sounds not used to native language thing. I can't remember if I go into more detail about it on Thursday or not. I'm going to go ahead and talk about it now, and then if I have a slide on it on Thursday, then we'll either review or I'll kind of judge if you remember what I said today, and we'll go from there. So we might talk about this in more detail Thursday. But basically, so I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but every language has different phonemes that it uses. A phoneme is basically like the kind of building block of the language. So in English, we have, some number of phonemes. I want to say it's like 30 or something. So all of the letters in the alphabet would be basically like a phoneme. So ba, ka, da, etc. The vowels often have more than one phoneme. So like A can be an a or an ah or an right? And then there's phonemes that we don't have letters for, like the th sound. The or ch, cha. So all those sounds are phonemes. But not all languages use the same phonemes. So English has a set of phonemes that it uses to make all the words that we say. There are other languages that maybe overlap, like maybe they use 30 of the phonemes that we use, but then they also have like 2 or 3 that we don't use. And maybe they don't use 10 of the ones that we use. Okay. So for example, in Japanese, they do not have a separate phoneme for the R and the L. So in English, we have R and la. In Japanese, they don't have those 2 separate phonemes. They only have one. So someone who's a native Japanese speaker, if they're trying to learn English, then they have difficulty and they might confuse those. Did you have a question or comment? You were just nodding. So.
Oh, no, I'm just Japanese and I'm surprised you brought that up.
Oh, yeah.
Everywhere I go here, they're like ramen, but you say ramen.
Yeah.
So my friends are like, sorry, ramen.
Yeah. So like even the way you're saying it, I feel it almost like Japanese combines the R and the L almost in a way. Yeah. Like the way you're saying it doesn't sound to me like an R or an L. It's like something in between, which is interesting. But then in English, we like separate them into 2 different things. I also know in like Hindi, there's 2 D sounds but it's not in native English, so I can't even make those two D sounds. And the interesting thing is that a lot of times when you don't have those phonemes in your language, like you can't perceive the difference. You can't hear it. So if someone right now started speaking Hindi to me and they were using those two different D sounds, to me they would both just sound like D. They would sound like duh and not like two separate things. But the interesting thing is that prior to 6 months, infants can perceive all of the phonemes in all of the world's languages. So if it's a Japanese baby growing up in a Japanese-speaking household, before 6 months, they will be able to hear the difference between R and L. If it's an English baby growing up speaking English, before 6 months, they will hear the two different D sound that are used in Hindi, and they can perceive that difference and distinguish them. But by 6 months, you lose some of that ability, and you can only distinguish the sounds that you were exposed to during those first 6 months of development. So if you, yeah, Margaret.
What happens if you expose babies to different sets?
So like a baby who's raised bilingual, then they would learn all the phonemes that they're exposed to, basically. So if you have a baby that's growing up in a household where they speak English about half the time and Japanese about half the time, then they would learn the R and L, and they would also learn any phonemes in Japanese that are not used in English. Yeah.
So that must be why it's encouraged to have your child learn languages way early on.
Yes, yeah, exposure to languages as early as possible is always going to benefit their ability to learn it. Definitely the longer you wait, the worse. And so, I mean, this would suggest that even prior to 6 months, you should try to start exposing your infant to other languages if you want them to be able to learn other languages. It's important. Now, I just had a question in my head that I don't know the answer to, but I don't know if you guys are asking the same question, is like, could you, like, let's say I grew up speaking only English and I want to learn Hindi at 34 years old. Could I go like listen to people speaking Hindi and just like immerse myself in that for a year and then eventually develop the ability to hear those different Ds? No clue. I don't know the answer to that. Seems like maybe, probably, but I don't know. The point is though, by 6 months, they lose that ability to hear different phonemes that are not used in their language. And this actually relates back to synaptic pruning. So there's some evidence that this process is partially due to synaptic pruning. So this is kind of an oversimplification, but you could almost think of it as like infants are born with like maybe a cluster of neurons that are good at hearing R and a cluster of neurons that are good at hearing L. But if they never are getting fired because they're not hearing those different phonemes, then the synapses for those phonemes are going to die off because they're not being used. So then you lose that ability to hear those different phonemes as you get into like 6 to 8 months old. Kind of another interesting thing that this tells us too is that the human brain is sort of born to learn language. Like it's born with this very ingrained genetic ability to absorb language, but the specific language that you learn depends entirely on your experience and on what you're exposed to. So, like no matter what ethnicity you're born as, you could just as easily learn English or Japanese or Hindi or any language as long as you're exposed to it in early childhood. So some other developments around 6 to 12 months, they start to detect sound regularities in human speech. So not only are they hearing the different phonemes, but they start to understand that certain phonemes are combined in specific ways. So like in English, it's very common to have, like vowels and consonants next to each other. Like the letters A-N are going to be next to each other in lots and lots of different words, right? In English, it's probably not very common to have like a V-R that isn't a word that you're pronouncing, right? Like I might be able to think of some, but it's not going to be very common. So infants around 6 to 12 months, they can actually detect those kinds of regularities. Like, okay, these phonemes are often paired together, but these ones often are not. And around 7 to 9 months, they start to divide speech into word-like units. So they start to understand that like speech has pauses, that it has words that are separate from other words. They can kind of start to pick all that apart. All right, so that's their developments in hearing. During the first 2 years, they're also going to make all kinds of developments in their visual understanding. So they will start to understand color. Their acuity will improve. So acuity is like how good your eyes are, basically. Like when you go to an eye doctor and you do the vision test and they tell you your vision's like 20/20 or whatever, that's acuity. So an infant, or well, at 6 months, their acuity is about 20/80. So that means an infant at 20 feet can see what most people can see at 80 feet. So again, everything is very blurry to them even at 6 months. But by the time they reach 2 years old, they'll have like the normal like 20/20 vision, assuming that they don't have any, issues with their vision. Like they don't have nearsightedness or farsightedness. If they don't have any issues like that, they'll have 20/20 vision by about 4 years old. They also start to develop the ability to scan and track objects. So around probably like 6 months, they'll get to the point where they can scan, like if you hold something in front of their eyes, they can follow it with their eyes. Their depth perception is also improving. So infants, when they're first born, basically have no depth perception at all. There's this test that they sometimes do. I can't remember. There might be pictures in your textbook of it, where they have this it's like a table, and half the table is glass. So it's like completely see-through. The other half of the table is covered in this kind of like checkered pattern, and they place the baby on that checkered pattern. And then under the glass, there's that same checkered pattern, and it's like lined up in a way that if you're like on the table looking through the glass, it like lines up. So it looks like it's straight, right? But your depth perception will tell you that checker is on the floor and not on the table, so I shouldn't crawl over there or I might fall, right? Infants, when they're first born, or even when I guess they're first crawling, which would probably be around 6 months, they lack that depth perception, so they'll just crawl right onto the glass and like not even care that it looks like they're about to fall. But as they get older, around like a year or so, they'll start to get scared, like they won't go to the glass because it looks like they're going to fall because they've developed their depth perception at that point. So they're developing depth perception. They're also developing their pattern perception, so they can start to recognize like faces. I talk about that next, I guess, but a face is a pattern, basically. But they can recognize other patterns too, so they can, tell like a checkered pattern from a stripes. So their pattern perception grows as well. In addition, like I said, they can recognize faces. So they typically are going to learn to recognize their caregiver's faces first. Whichever caregiver they spend the most time with, like maybe that's their mom, they'll usually recognize that face first. And then they'll kind of add faces that they recognize depending on who they're around often. They'll also start to recognize facial expressions, so they can tell the difference between like a happy face and a sad face, a smile and a frown. Kind of another interesting thing with faces, they also will show what's called their own race bias by 3 months. So own race bias refers to the fact that people tend to be better at distinguishing faces within their own ethnicity compared to faces outside of their ethnicity. And infants start to show that bias as early as 3 months old, where they will recognize people of the same race as them, but have a harder time recognizing people that are of a different race. And then one of the more important kind of perceptual abilities, which I was talking about earlier, is called intermodal perception. That's the ability to bind all these various perceptual experiences to kind of experience the world as like objects that are discrete and coherent. So again, they would probably around like 6 months or so is where they start to develop this intermodal perception, and then it improves over the first 2 years, where they get to where they can tell like, okay, this object is separate from other objects, and it has its own color and its own properties, and it makes its own sound, and all those things are kind of bound together as an object instead of just being like these free floating perceptions. Any questions so far about the perceptual developments that are made? Okay, So some other important cognitive developments. So they are also developing the ability to learn through various mechanisms. So in an intro psych class, you probably would have learned about like classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modeling. All different methods of basically learning associations. So during these first 2 years, they're developing their ability to make those various associations and to learn through those different mechanisms. So just like quick review. So classical conditioning, if you remember, that's where you're making really passive associations. So that would be like Pavlov with his dogs and the bell, where the dogs would salivate at the sound of a bell. You all kind of know what I'm talking about? Okay. Operant conditioning is more active, where you have to actually like perform a behavior, and then that's going to be either rewarded or punished, and to increase or decrease the likelihood of that behavior. So like, you might, if a toddler is throwing a tantrum, you might put them in timeout. So you're kind of taking away a little bit of their freedom for a little bit of time. Go sit in this chair and time out so that you can deal with your emotions. That would be operant conditioning. You're kind of punishing them for throwing a tantrum, basically. They can also learn through modeling. So modeling is where they're observing the behavior of those around them and mimicking that behavior, or they might model through conditioning as well. So they might see that someone else gets punished for doing something bad, so they learn not to do that behavior. They also will have advances in all kinds of things like their attention capacity, how long they can spend looking at a particular stimulus. Infants have very low attentional capacity. They can't even necessarily focus on a toy or an object for very long. They get bored very quickly of things. So if you hand them a toy or something, they might be like totally enraptured by that thing for a little bit, and then they'll discard it and kind of want something new. That attention capacity will build over all of childhood, but by the end of 2, they might be able to engage with something for a much longer period of time. Their memory is also developing. Another thing, I gotta look further ahead at my notes so I can remember when I plan to talk about things. Oh, I have it listed here, so I was planning on talking about it. Infantile amnesia. So infantile amnesia refers to this idea that most people do not have memories prior to like 3 to 5 years old. So if right now you try to think back, like what's your earliest memory that you can recall? And it has to be a true memory too. So like, I know my parents told me stories about things that happened when I was a baby. Like they might have told me about something silly I did or whatever. I might remember my parent telling me that story, but I don't have an actual memory of experiencing that thing myself, right? So most of us don't have true episodic memories of something that happened in our life prior to like 3 to 5 years old. And there's a lot of reasons or kind of speculations about why that might be. One theory is that for us to develop memories, we need language. So there's one theory that says that a lot of our memories are sort of coded using language, and so before you learn language, there's no way to store a memory because you don't have the coding for it, basically. There's another theory that says that our ability to remember things depends heavily on like a sense of self. So knowing that I am a person that is separate from all of you people and that my experiences are different from all of your experiences, that sense of self might also be really important for storing memories. And so we don't really develop that sense of self until about like 2-ish, 2.5. So there's a couple different theories about why infantile amnesia occurs. Nobody's really sure at this point yet, like why don't we remember things from that earlier age? But our memory is still, so even though right now I don't remember things that happened prior to when I was 3, when I was 2, my memory would have been better than when I was 1, right? So if you would ask me at 2 years old, do you remember what you had for breakfast yesterday? I would probably remember that. If you could somehow ask an infant if they remembered what they had for breakfast the day before, they probably wouldn't have a memory of that. So memory's getting better, attention's getting better. Executive function is basically our ability to kind of self-regulate, regulate our emotions, set goals and go for them, plan our movements and our day. Again, that's starting out very poor, develops gradually during the first 2 years, although none of those things will be mastered at this point. So by 2, you've gotten a lot better at attention, memory, and executive function, but there's still kind of a long way to go in developing those skills fully. All right, related to all of this development is Piaget's theory. So remember, Piaget is one of those kind of early theorists that we talked about at the beginning, and he talked about these different stages that we go through in our cognitive development. The very first stage, according to Piaget, is called the sensory motor stage. And basically during this time, during these first 2 years, the focus is on building up these sensory and motor schemes. So at the very beginning, an infant is really working on its ability to, we already talked about these perceptual things. It's working on its ability to see and hear, etc. And then also motor, like how to move, like we talked about all those motor developments. But then it's also important to put all that together. So in infant, if you have a toy that you're holding above them and they want that toy, they probably are not going to have the ability to reach out and grab it and pull it. And there's all kinds of things, like they might not see it clearly to begin with. Even if they can see it, they don't have the motor control to reach and sort of control their arm in the way to do that. So the very beginning is just building those abilities to, like, okay, I can see this toy visually. I know where it is in space because I have depth perception now. And I can control my arm in this way, so I'm going to reach out and grab it and bring it to me. So building just those very simple sensory motor schemes is kind of step one of the sensory motor stage. A lot of this is done through what's called circular reactions. Circular reactions is where, if you've ever, again, watched an infant like just laying in a crib and they're awake, often they're kind of just like moving around, like sort of randomly, like doing this a lot. And they might accidentally, while they're doing that, like punch a toy, like the mobile thing that's hanging above them, they might accidentally hit it. And then they might kind of put that together. They might realize, oh, if I move my arm in this way, then I can touch this object that I want. So I'm going to keep doing that. And then they sort of build off that until they get to the point that they can reach and grab it and pull it towards them. So those circular reactions are really important for developing those sensory and motor schemes. By the end of the sensory motor stage, they will have developed what's called object permanence. Object permanence is basically knowing that when I can't see something, it still exists. So an infant does not have object permanence. They basically behave as if, like, if I'm holding this marker, they're really interested in it, they really want it. As soon as I hide it, it's like it's gone from the world, it doesn't exist anymore. But over time, they'll build up that ability to understand that, no, it still exists, you just can't see it. One of the tests they do for this, they have, let me see if I can remember all the details. They have this kind of like wood or cardboard panel that has a window cut out in it. And the infant will be like seated on one side, just kind of looking through the window. And they'll have some object. For whatever reason, the experiment, I remember they had a carrot. So they have like a carrot on this side, and they move the carrot behind the panel so it comes out over here. And sometimes they do it in a way where it does like what you would expect. So the carrot goes behind the window, you see it pop up here for a little bit, and then it comes out the other side. Other times they do it where the carrot's going and it doesn't pop up here, but then it comes out the other side, okay? An infant that has object permanence and understands that this carrot exists even when it's behind here should like know that it should show up here. So if the infant has object permanence and it doesn't show up there in the middle, then they should show surprise in some way. And usually the way an infant shows surprise is just by engaging with it. So usually they'll do this kind of over and over again until the infant starts to get bored. And then they'll switch to this condition where they make it so it doesn't show up in the middle. And if the infant has object permanence, then it'll draw its attention back because that's something new that they weren't expecting. They were expecting the carrot to show up there, but it didn't, okay? So that's kind of one way that they test object permanence. And they find, I can't remember the age, I want to say by a year old for sure they've started to develop that. And then another thing that's happening during, sorry, my voice is going. This is the last slide, so it's good timing. They start to develop mental representations and symbolic understanding. So they can start to understand, especially by 2, they start to understand that words are kind of like metaphors for things. So you can talk to a toddler about something that's not right in front of them. You can say like, hey, do you want to go for a walk to the park? And they understand that the word park represents this thing that's like way across town that they can't see right now, that it's like a symbol that kind of stands in place of that actual thing. So they start to understand those mental representations and symbolic understanding by the end of this sensory motor stage. Okay, any questions?